It really is a shame that we didn't get to see Achilles more often, especially considering that he's one of the more well-known servants. Well, since, he's Achilles. Whether it's through some movie or TV show or a random lesson of Greek mythology, you've definitely heard the name Achilles before. Personally, I think that he was really underplayed and underdeveloped as a servant. He's a rider that we barely saw in his chariot and has noble phantasms and fighting ability that's equal to Vladwell in Romania. But you wouldn't know that because the only times that we ever got to see him fight for real was against Chiron. Like, take this in. Achilles has a noble phantasm that literally would have made it impossible for the Black faction to win if Chiron wasn't on their team. And you'll see why in my video tomorrow explaining his abilities and noble phantasms. But since Fate Apocrypha pretty much assumes that you already know all the backstories and abilities of the servants, you must have been pretty damn confused when Astolfo received literal plot armor from Achilles. Things do make a little more sense once you get a bit more information surrounding that particular event. But first, even though you know who Achilles is, you probably aren't familiar with his origins. So let's talk a bit more about one of the greatest Greek heroes from the Trojan War, who we know from Fate Apocrypha as the Rider of Red. Achilles was the son of the sea nymph Thetis and the king Peleus. Thetis was the goddess of water, but Peleus was just a mere man, meaning that Achilles himself was mortal. A quick side note though, because I'm sure a lot of you have the question on how Achilles knows Atalanta. Well, other than the fact that they both stem from Greek mythology, they do have a connection. Peleus was a part of Jason and the Argonauts during their attempt to find the Golden Fleece. Not only that, but he also took part in the Caledonian boar hunt. If this sounds familiar at all, that's because if you remember from her episode a couple weeks ago, Atalanta took part in both those events. Peleus even had a wrestling match against her and lost, so it's not unlikely that Peleus told stories about Atalanta to Achilles. But back to what I was talking about. Peleus being human meant Achilles was only a demigod, so he wasn't immortal. This had worried Thetis, so she did everything she could to make him immortal. This included burning him over a fire every night, then healing him with some ambrosial ointment, which, if you didn't know, ambrosia was a substance of the gods which is supposed to bring immortality to those who come into contact with it. Not only did she burn him alive multiple times, she also dunked him in the river Styx, because that was also thought to grant immortality. Which, of course, it ended up doing. Achilles did in fact become immortal, but there was one small mistake that Thetis overlooked while dipping Achilles in the river. Apparently, she had gripped his legs so tight around the heel area that none of the water came into contact with it. This is starting to sound vaguely familiar. Literally, if these people just paid a little bit more attention, they'd be unstoppable heroic spirits. But I guess stories wouldn't be interesting if the hero was super OP and had no weaknesses. So, as you'd expect, the term Achilles' heel refers to the only point of his body where he's mortal and can be killed. Now, this is where the story splits. It's said that either Achilles was abandoned by his mother later on due to a fight between her and Peleus, or a seer predicted that Achilles was to die in a battle against the Trojans, so in order to avoid that, she sent him to the island of Skyros under the guise of a girl named Piera. Regardless, it was during this time that Achilles began to receive training. Whether it was Achilles' own volition to learn to fight, or his father's concern for his son, he learned to fight nonetheless. And it was from none other than Chiron himself, who, fun fact, also trained Hercules. Fast forward a few more years, and Zeus is thinking that the Earth is having an overpopulation problem. So he wants to reduce that number by a little bit. What does he do? He incites a war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Long story short though, the war started over one king stealing the woman of the other king. The Prince of Troy, Paris, with the help of Aphrodite, seduced and stole away the king of Sparta's wife, Helen. And so the king of Sparta calls together Greece's greatest warriors to invade Troy so that he can get his wife back. Achilles was the commander of 50 ships, and each had 50 warriors known as the Myrmidons, which were a colony of ants transformed by Zeus into humans to become strong warriors. This war goes on for 9 years before anything important even happens. Achilles has led numerous battles and hadn't lost a single one. He was the fastest one on the battlefield, with an immortal body and a spear given to him by his father. He rode his chariot that was pulled by 3 horses, 2 of which were actual god-given gifts from Poseidon. He was pretty much an unstoppable force. Yet, somehow, no matter how many battles he won, they couldn't siege the city of Troy. As we near the 10th year of the war, Achilles' Achaean army had become cursed by a priest of Apollo. Their army's commander, Agamemnon, had stolen this priest's daughter and refused to give her back. As such, soldiers began to die one by one to an unknown plague. The commander had no choice but to return the priest's daughter. But now that he was down one woman, he needed another to replace the old one. Agamemnon decides to take Achilles' battle prize, Briseis, who Achilles would have received as a reward for winning the war. Achilles had actually loved Briseis, but did not contest the commander's decision. Instead, he withdrew from the war and stopped fighting for Greece. The tides of battle began to shift as the Trojans started to push back the Greek forces. You see, the Trojans knew that the Greeks' strongest fighter wasn't around, so they continuously assaulted and gained back once lost ground. Patroclus, who had grown up with Achilles almost as a brother, still fought on the front lines. He convinced Achilles to lend him his armor so that he could pretend to be Achilles on the battlefield. Achilles accepted, but it was supposed to be only until they pushed the Trojans back from the ships, which they had ended up doing. But Patroclus wanted more and chased the Trojans to the gate. He ended up getting into a one-on-one fight with the Trojan prince Hector, who was the strongest Trojan warrior at the time. As such, Patroclus ended up getting killed by him. When Achilles had found this out, he was absolutely struck with grief, and he knew that he had to rejoin the battle to avenge his friend. His mother saw that this was going to happen, so she came to comfort Achilles. She had also brought new armor and a shield created by the god of blacksmiths himself, Hephaestus. Achilles returns to the battlefield and kills a great number of Trojans in search of Hector. Achilles finally finds Hector and gets to face off with him in a one-on-one fight. Hector never stood a chance, and he knew it. So before he was going to die, he asked Achilles to treat his body with respect after he was dead. However, Achilles declined, and instead attaches the corpse to his chariot and drags it all the way back to his ship. This disrespectful act had angered the god Apollo, so as the destruction of Troy grew near with Achilles invading the city and whatnot, the king of Troy, Paris, drew his bow and fired it. It's said that this arrow was guided by Apollo himself to strike right at Achilles' weak point, his heel. Even after this though, Achilles still fought all the Trojans around him, taking out quite a few before succumbing to his own mortality and taking several arrows to the heart. So that's his story pretty much. This was the really abridged version of Achilles' whole story from the Iliad. If you want to know more, then I highly recommend watching the movie Troy. It's pretty consistent with what I just talked about, and it's not a bad movie in general. But if you take in certain aspects of this story, you'll realize why certain things in the show played out the way that they did. But Achilles has like 5 noble phantasms, and I really want to go in depth as how they played their role in the show with certain key events, which is why I'm going to end this video here and upload the part 2 tomorrow. So as always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So until next time, ciao!